Hi everyone, this is Preston Clark with LawRoom. Thanks so much for joining. It is at the top of the hour now, 11 a.m. Pacific. A lot of people are just joining right now, so I'm going to wait just one more minute, or maybe a minute and a half before I get started. If you wouldn't mind doing me a favor, for those of you who are already on, if you could just type into the question or chat box on the right, I can hear you, or audio is good, or something to that effect, so I know that, that you're hearing me loud and clear. I would much appreciate it. Audio is good. Okay, thumbs up. Thank you. Thanks everyone. Okay, so yeah, just give me one more minute and then we will jump into this. Okay, we are going to get started. Thanks everyone for joining today. This is Preston Clark with LawRoom. Today we're going to be talking about how fast growth tech companies stay in compliance. My background is I'm an attorney, used to be a compliance attorney for the largest employer in South Florida. LawRoom is based in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is where I reside now, and LawRoom is one of the leading providers of compliance education and compliance training for over 2,500 organizations, 650 of which are colleges and universities, and then a large population of that are fast-growing tech companies, like many of you who are on the webinar today. I'm sure many of you have been on GoToWebinar in this platform before, but the quick blocking and tackling is, if you have any questions, there's a question toggle on the right sidebar. Feel free to submit any questions you have there, and if I have time, I'll certainly dive into those, and if I don't, happy to take those offline, and I'll email you back with any answers. We're going to run this very, very tight, so we only set aside 30 minutes. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I have some very specific talk tracks that I want to hit on, and we may get this done in 25 minutes. I certainly want this to be a good use of your time, but that doesn't necessarily translate into how long and how much of your time I take. So I'll try to make this very impactful, very useful, and as well as short. So with that, let's dive into it. Again, thanks everyone for joining. This is Preston Clark with LawRoom. Webinar today is entitled How Fast Growth Tech Companies Stay in Compliance. The agenda of the next 30 minutes, we're going to start with defining the risk and building the case, really just understanding compliance in fast-growing tech companies and what's unique about those organizations that makes compliance a little bit trickier than for others. We'll talk about training trends in tech. As I mentioned, as an organization that's training hundreds of large tech companies, we understand deeply many of the compliance and training needs that you have, and so I want to talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about some specific growth challenges. This is going to be where we bring in case studies, and we'll talk a little bit about Airbnb and Guidewire, and namely, among others, and some of the challenges that they faced in approaching these problems as it related to multiple locations and rapid hiring, rapid growth, and the decentralized nature of having multi-locations. We'll talk about the tracking aspect, kind of a boring aspect of the next 25 minutes, but certainly from a compliance perspective important. Whatever type of compliance you're approaching, you certainly want to have records of what's been completed and how your organization is staying in compliance. And so we'll spend a couple of minutes on that as well. And then I'll spend about 60 seconds at the end telling you a little bit about LawRoom and our history, but certainly that won't be the bulk of the next 25 minutes. Okay, so with that, insert scary headline about tech company having major PR issue relating to regulatory compliance, discrimination, harassment, data security. So this is meant to be ironic, no doubt. not really here to scare any of you into why compliance matters. I'm making the assumption that if you join the webinar today, you believe that your organization needs to do more than it's currently doing, or maybe do it differently, or maybe doing it better. But I think a lot of the conversations stem from the what if, and as you're talking to the C-level folks in your organization, pushing for different approaches to compliance, I think that a lot of times when we talk about defining the risk, we're quick to sort of say, you know, look what happened to Zenefits, or look what happened to Uber, or whatever it might be, to highlight specific issues. But the fact is, compliance typically is underscored by a systematic approach to something that's going on within your organization, whether it's data security or discrimination or harassment or PCI compliance or whatever it might be. And our approach generally, and the tech companies we work with, because they care so much about their personnel, and because so much of their growth story is about building great organizations, the notion of just going in and saying we should be in compliance because, you know, if we don't, we're going to have a PR nightmare, that tends not to be the audience we talk to. That tends not to be the driver. And so for defining the risk, I'm making an assumption here that each of you has an understanding of where the risks lie for you from a compliance perspective, whether it's relating to data security, whether it's relating to PCI, whether it's relating to HIPAA, if it's anti-harassment, discrimination, ethics, etc. I assume that you have a grasp on what those are, and certainly the point of this call and this webinar today isn't to diagnose each of you who are on. We have an amazing group who are on the webinar today, which is awesome, from all over the country, but each of you has a unique business, and so certainly the point of today is not to say, you know, this is what you should be doing specifically as it relates to a compliance requirement, but look at it more broadly and say, what are ways organizations like yours are approaching compliance? I mentioned this from the outset, but we're going to frame a lot of today in this webinar around 3 case studies, Airbnb, namely, and Guidewire, 3 of whom are clients of ours, and talk a little bit about and tell their stories a little bit in a way that relates to compliance and addresses some of their challenges, which I suspect many of you all share. And so I want to highlight those and tell sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly of those, and how they ultimately approach compliance. And that, again, that'll sort of be a backdrop throughout the slides and throughout the deck. Okay, so LawRoom is going to train about 2 million people, employees and students this year alone, and so we see large trends of training, which is one of the primary ways that organizations meet their compliance requirements, which is, again, contextualizing this presentation in the broader frame of what we do at LawRoom, which is compliance education and compliance training for employees. And across the board, the courses that get the most usage and adoption for tech companies specifically relate to anti-harassment, diversity, ethics, data security and privacy, PCI, HIPAA, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. We're starting to see human trafficking come up a bit more than it did historically. And so I bring these up because we unfortunately didn't do a poll prior to the webinar. I wish we had. In retrospect, it would have been useful for me to understand how each of you see these issues and whether or not these are the ones you're thinking about. I think that anti-harassment tends to be at the top of the list because it's the one that tends to make the biggest headlines, although data security is certainly competing with it at this point. Diversity is right up there too, but I think anti-harassment is the one that, you know, it's the one where the CEO walks in and says, hey, we have to do something about this. What are we doing? It's important. And the other ones tend to come at a later stage or are more secondary. So this has always been a driver in the state of California, which some of you who are on today are based. There's a regulation called AB 1825, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, who are in California, that mandates anti-harassment training for companies over 50 employees for all supervisors every other year. And so that's been a big driver in California. It's also a big driver in Connecticut and Maine. But you know, we work with companies all over the country, and anti-harassment is a pervasive initiative that we see widely adopted. And then I'd say ethics and data security are the other two that we see very widely adopted. Ethics, just because there's too much risk going on. There's too many decisions that each of your employees get to make discretionarily that you want to empower them to make discretionarily, especially in a fast-growing company where you do need to empower your people. But having sort of a baseline code of ethics, as it were, and a baseline understanding of what's right and wrong in the workplace tends to make you feel a little bit better about that empowerment. And then data security, the issue there is that whether you're going out to, whether you store personal data as a core part of your business or not, you're probably storing some type of personal identifiable information of customers, of users, whether you're B2B or B2C. And the thought there is that there's a lot of risk tied into how your organization is handling this data, and a lot what we're seeing is a lot of insurance policies around data security require internal policies that your employees have to have signed off on relating to code of conduct and behavior of how you treat and manage sensitive information, both for employees and for customers. And so we're seeing widespread adoption and usage, like coming off of the Ashley Madison story that was all over the news. That really propelled things where folks were saying, you know, this is certainly, we're not necessarily in a business that's anywhere near theirs, but we understand that this can be quite explosive, and we certainly wouldn't want our business brought to its knees over a data breach. And then when you couple that with we see that phishing scams are by and large one of the predominant drivers of data security breaches, and we know that that then becomes an employee issue, right? It's not your head of IT that is at fault, right? It is, you know, John, the employee, who got the phishing scam email, who didn't understand what to look for in phishing scams, clicked on something, and then that became an issue, and that was sort of was the Trojan horse of the data breach, the entry point. And so we're seeing, again, widespread adoption there around data security. So I want to take a couple minutes now to talk about Airbnb specifically and some of their challenges, and I hope that, or I suspect that some of these challenges are relevant to you. We all know who Airbnb is, so I'm not going to tell you what they do or who they are, but I will say in this context, they needed a training that could help manage their fast growth, and that related to not only headcount, but multiple locations across the country and across the world. And then the issue was, I'm sure many of you saw on Glassdoor that Airbnb was the top-ranked place to work in the country for 2015. And so they have this really high standard and high commitment to the employee experience in the Bay Area or wherever you might be. You know, you're out there recruiting millennials. They're hard to get. It's a competitive market. And you think about the sensitivity around issues of diversity and ethics and discrimination and anti-harassment and data security, to be redundant, and you don't want to, and they didn't specifically want to be off-brand. They had invested so much in the onboarding experience for their employees that they didn't want to be off-brand with their approach to compliance education, where it seemed like the same issues that they were elevating, saying were super important, like diversity, were undermined by a training program that was very low quality, because that just it runs a little antithetical to say we care a lot about diversity, now go watch this boring PowerPoint for 35 minutes and come back and feel really good about how strong our commitment is, because certainly we haven't invested or been thoughtful about how we approach this type of education. So you know, their challenges were vast in this regard. I think that their assumption and their plan was that they were going to do in-person training, bringing in various experts to meet the different types of training requirements they had for each calendar year. And then ultimately, the underlying challenge there was that they had too many locations to monitor and track and feel good that each location was having a consistent message, because there is this compliance component, there is this tracking component, there is this idea that we don't want the Dublin office doing something fundamentally different from the San Francisco office. There may be some customization and localization that needs to occur for the course and the program to be more relevant to that audience, but you don't want it a totally different message being communicated, because there's certainly some, as it relates to ethics and anti-harassment, there are some underlying and consistent mantras and themes and values that Airbnb wants to be consistent with. They don't want to just go from each country and have a totally different viewpoint on these topics. Excuse the rather obnoxious arrows, but I want to sort of focus on three of the core drivers for Airbnb's decision-making process around compliance training. They need it to be scalable. I mentioned the aspect of in-person training, and that was certainly a driver for them. Mass deployments, tracking, the idea that you're going to do a send that's going to reach people all across the US and all across the world, and that you need to be able to run reports that shows that different employees have completed different trainings, and that if there's a policy that it's attached to it, that they've acknowledged the policy, whether it's anti-harassment or data security or ethics, etc. But all of that has to be done in a way that's scalable, as many of you are facing the challenge today of, compliance is just going to represent one small part of your job, but it's a super important one that you want to get right. In the meantime, you're hiring very, very quickly, and so you have to sort of keep your arms around this. You want it to be qualitatively good, but you also need to be able to scale. However you approach this needs to be scalable to match every other thing you're probably doing that is very, very scalable. Engaging user experience, this goes back to the comment I made about on brand. It's super important for all of you who are investing heavily in recruiting and retention of your workforce and building a great culture and a great place to work, that however you're engaging with your employees is reflective of your brand and your mission, and it doesn't seem like it's a big step down. To sort of run parallel in a different direction for a second, one of our big markets as a training company is higher education, and we're one of the largest providers of sexual violence and substance abuse prevention training in higher education, and we work with everyone from Stanford and Harvard and Yale to Ohio State University. So we train hundreds of thousands of people in that side of the business, and we're actually the first training experience and the first educational experience that incoming freshmen experience prior to arriving on campus. And you think about the significance of that and the weight and almost the burden of that, of saying, before hundreds of thousands of students arrive on campus for the first time, they're going to have to go through a training program that needs to match the standards of these very prestigious institutions that are collecting millions and millions of dollars in tuition every year. And so it's very much reflective of the brand. And so I just sort of underscore that whether it's a tech company or an institution of higher learning, you really want to get this part right as it relates to the qualitative experience for your employees. The last part, easy tracking and reporting. This is very blocking and tackling, but they knew that inside of all of this and all of this very ambitious approach to compliance, that they needed to have everything stored. They need to have a compliance platform of record where they could look back 2 years or 3 years and see, did John Smith acknowledge the data security policy? Did he complete the anti-harassment training course? And so, shouldn't be a surprise to you there, but certainly it was a key driver for Airbnb. Many of you may be familiar with Namely. I just wanted to pull one part of this. This was Ashley, Director of People at Namely, who's been a great partner and friend to us. Diversity in the context of they had a very diverse employee base. And so one of the problems that they were trying to solve for is that as diversity was going to be ingrained in their culture, how were they going to train and educate around diversity so that all of these different people, this melting pot of people from all over the world, could understand how to communicate with each other in a way that was consistent and true to the Great Namely brand and culture that they're developing. So I just wanted to quickly touch on that as well, that's certainly the diversity aspect of tech companies, I think, is something that is more common than perhaps in other industries, and so certainly it was a big driver for Namely. To talk for a minute about centralized tracking, and I think that this is pretty intuitive and perhaps obvious, but we talk to both startups as well as really large established tech companies, and we're surprised every day at some of the really large tech companies out there who have locations all over the world, and they have no doubt great HR departments, great compliance departments, but there's no centralized control over the records, over compliance records, because each office is effectively functioning administratively independent. They may share a CFO, they may share some resources at the C level, but the notion of compliance centralization is still foreign to them. And so I think that a big driver in this is, even if we talk to organizations that feel really strong about what they're doing, they actually love their approach to compliance training, they think that they're knocking it out of the park, but then the tracking aspect becomes where the pain point, where the anxiety is. The CEO walks in and says, hey, I need to see, the last 18 months of records of, who's accepted our anti-harassment policy, who's completed the diversity course, and who's been trained on phishing scams for data security. And there's no central archive to pull that from, nor are there any certainties around how each individual across the multi-locations of the organization were trained. So then there's the notion of, did everyone experience something similar, or did the folks in Rio experience something different from the folks in Tokyo, whereby it's really going to be difficult, if there ever is an issue, to stand behind what was conveyed, how it was communicated, and ultimately what was tracked. And so this, to contextualize it, this is just a screenshot of our platform where it shows what it looks like when someone is completing a policy acknowledgement. In this case, it's just a sample policy acknowledgement for anti-harassment. Along the lines of what we're already talking about as it relates to why online, or what are some of the ways that folks like Airbnb and Namely and Guidewire approached compliance training, no doubt many of you on the call are very passionate about your organizations, you're very passionate about your employees, and the notion of online training feels immediately like a departure from the high-touch sort of white glove experience you're trying to create for your organization that, quite frankly, is reflective of the culture you're trying to build. And we totally get that. Like every tech company we work with, the start of the conversation typically goes, we really would rather do this in person. And we understand that, we get it. It makes sense. It's consistent with what you're trying to do. But this slide is interesting because across the country, when you look at different types of training, and this is a little bit tricky to read. I look at this slide all the time, but I realize for many of you it's the first time, or for all of you it's the first time. If you look at the third one down, it says mandatory or compliance training, and then it has various different colors. The green and the orange reflect mostly online or all online. I bring it up because mandatory and compliance training, by and large, are the only type of online training that is being delivered for a lot of the startups and tech companies we work with. And that came out a bit awkwardly, so let me restate it. The organizations we're working with that are fast-growing tech companies are heavy into training. They're investing a lot in sales training and customer success training and executive development, et cetera. When they make those investments, they're bringing in outside experts, or they're sending folks off-site for training programs. But the one type of training that's consistently managed online, for all the reasons we've been talking about today, is mandatory or compliance training. So, to the extent that you're struggling with the idea of, gosh, this feels like a departure, I just want to acknowledge that I get it. I get that all of these training initiatives feel like they should be delivered in person, and you're mostly right. And by mostly right, I mean you're consistent with how the nation looks at training, except in the realm of compliance, which by and large is done online, and that's a driver of driven by consistency of message and record keeping and tracking, and making sure that, if John was out sick the day Bob the briefcase came in to train on anti-harassment, that you can still capture him. You can still get him to complete a training program. You don't have to bring the briefcase back in to give another presentation on anti-harassment in order to make sure that you've covered all your bases. This slide always makes me laugh, so I thought I'd just talk about it for a minute. Want to be realistic about what we're talking about here. We're talking about compliance training. We've been working with Airbnb for a long time, and Gia's a good friend of LawRoom, and her quote to us was, "We had compliments from our employees on the training. They all said it was well done and on brand. Compliments don't come easy." We need to acknowledge that we're talking about anti-harassment, data security, ethics, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, PCI, HIPAA. These aren't general topics that your employees are passionate about, right? They want to be trained on the new version of Photoshop. They want to be trained on effective ways to close deals and shorten sales cycles. They want things that are related to their key performance indicators on the job. And so the bar that you're trying to set is not one of, you're not going to expect a sea of people to walk into your office saying, "Hey, I just want to thank you for that awesome anti-harassment training program." But you also want them to acknowledge that this is probably something that is better than what they've experienced in the past at other organizations, and is reflective of the commitment that your organization has to these very sensitive and important topics. And so we laugh about it because, again, we know that we're not going to be as popular as a course on sales or on customer success strategy or management strategy, but nevertheless, this stuff is so important to the future of your organization that you want to get it right, and you want it to reflect the breadth and strength of your commitment to these very important topics. All right. With that, I'm just going to talk about LawRoom for 1 minute, and then I'll let everyone head off and back to work for the rest of the afternoon. LawRoom's been in business for 20 years. We're based in California. We have 10 attorneys on staff who are responsible for building and updating and maintaining our courses from a state-by-state and federal and international compliance perspective. We'll train over 2 million people in 2016, and we're providing services for over 2,500 organizations across the country. That's a quick snapshot of who we are. Obviously, when people are thinking about working with a compliance organization like ours, the history is one you want to understand. What's the reputation? You don't want to place a bet with an organization that doesn't necessarily have the legal pedigree or the standards, because laws change, regulations change, both again at state, federal, and international level, and you want to know that whatever you're training on is going to be monitored, and if an update needs to be rendered, that's done, and you don't have to have your legal team, if you have one, monitoring how you're training your workforce and making sure that what you're educating on is up to date. That's it. Again, my name is Preston Clark. My contact information is there. We do provide online training, as you've no doubt gathered. So if you'd like more information about how your organization can leverage what we're doing in a similar fashion as Airbnb and Guidewire and others, we'd love to have that conversation. Feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email to p.clark@lawroom.com. That's it. Thanks everyone for joining today. I will send out a recording of this after the webinar along with the slides. If you have any other questions, feel free to put them in the question box now. I'll leave this open for another minute, or of course, as I mentioned, feel free to send me an email. Thank you so much.